So I've been studying housing for quite a while and working with Liz at the local People for Housing organization for some time. And so that's why I'm really excited to talk with you about housing opportunities for faith-based organizations. I'm sure I don't need to give you any background about the housing crisis in California and Orange County. But one of the things that we're here to talk about is the role that faith-based organizations can play in hopefully helping to alleviate some of our housing issues. Of course, the big sort of bill that passed with great fanfare a couple of years ago was SB4, a bill that was sponsored written by San Francisco Senator Scott Wiener, who's probably the most prolific and most pro-housing legislator in the state. It was called, that is kind of a pun, Yes in God's Backyard was the way the bill was called, kind of reference to the YIMBY or Yes in My Backyard movement. After a few years, I think it's become relatively clear that the bill, while kind of a promising start, also has a lot of challenges and it's been very difficult for faith-based organizations to use. So I want to walk through some of what the bill is intended to do, what some of the challenges are that have come from it, but then I think more importantly what I want to talk to you about is what I think may be some more effective opportunities that state housing law offers for religious organizations, because in fact right now state housing law has lots of different tools that can be used to advance housing production. And then also kind of come back at the end to talk a little bit more about SB4 and how I see it more as like the beginning of a conversation about how religious organizations kind of assist with resolving the housing crisis as opposed to kind of really, kind of an end state or a silver bullet that can get us through the housing crisis. So to start with SB4, Cesar kind of talked a little bit about some of the basics of SB4. The idea with SB4 was that it would allow religious organizations to build relatively dense housing as of right on parcels of land that they own. As of right is kind of a legal term of art that would basically mean that you could construct housing on property that you own without having to go through this whole rigmarole of discretionary review that is normally required for any kind of project to be approved. And that's a really big deal because if you know anything about local housing politics, you know that any kind of housing project often goes through a real gauntlet of discretionary approvals where you're going to have to go through numerous lengthy hearings where you get shouted at by neighbors who don't want anything in their backyard. And then if your project comes out of that successfully, it's usually many years later with lots of fees and stuff added on. So to be able to avoid all of that is really, really promising. And furthermore, religious organizations can use SB4 on property that isn't even zoned residential. So you wouldn't even have to go through the process of a rezoning. And then the final kind of advantage of SB4 is that it would exempt a project from the California Environmental Quality Act, which again, if you know much about the process of getting housing approved in California, you know this law called CEQA is also a really big headache for developers because it adds a lot of costs and a lot of delays to the process of getting housing approved. So to kind of bypass that is also a pretty big deal. Now, SB4 doesn't actually create a true by-right process because there's still a lot of standards that cities can still apply, but it's something sort of like a by-right process. So that's kind of the overview of what Senator Wiener was attempting to do, and you can kind of see the real promise of the law, right? To allow religious organizations to build housing without all of the normal headaches that would accompany a housing development project. But the law came with a lot of really significant caveats that has made it difficult to navigate. And there's really three. One is there's limits on what locations can be used, right? So it has to be in an urbanized area, it can't be in a fire zone, can't be in a flood zone. There's all kinds of restrictions about it being near an industrial property, which are very complicated. But even those, honestly, are not the main kind of drawbacks or difficulties with the statute. The main difficulties are twofold. One is the housing has to be 100% low income or 80% low income and 20% moderate income housing, which means it isn't really going to work financially unless you have significant sources of subsidies. And putting together this sort of package of subsidies that's required for this level of affordability requires some degree of expertise. There's affordable housing developers who specialize in putting together these subsidies because it's very difficult to put together the application for getting the required subsidies. So the first thing I would say is, if you're thinking about going down this pathway, you definitely want to partner with an affordable housing developer who has some expertise in developing affordable housing. Because again, you're going to need to put those subsidies together, and it really isn't as simple as just applying for the subsidies. It's a very complex process. The second issue is, I believe this is the second kind of bigger issue I see, is of course you have to hire construction labor at the prevailing wage, meaning essentially paying union level wages for labor, which is significantly more expensive than non-union labor. And so the two things in combination kind of make it really difficult to finance, right? Because you have to somehow figure out how you're going to finance a 100% affordable project, and then also how you're going to finance the construction labor. There is an exception if the housing is 10 units or fewer, then you don't have to do the prevailing wages. So that's one option. But of course, if it's a smaller project like that, it's also going to make it difficult to put together the subsidies. So you kind of have to think about all the pros and cons of how you put together the subsidies with a smaller project like that. But certainly I think a smaller project might have a better chance of making it through because you don't have to deal with the prevailing wage. So anyway, putting those two together is what really makes the process very challenging. And I think where it's going to work best is, again, a smaller project of 10 units or fewer. And also I think it may be an option in really high-cost areas. And of course, Orange County is a very high-cost area where you can actually turn a profit even where it's 100% affordable and you're paying the prevailing wage. There's some evidence that SB 35 is another kind of similar law that also has an affordability component and requirement of using prevailing wage. And it's had some limited success in very high-cost areas of the state. So those are going to be the places where I think you'll be able to use SB4. But really what I wanted to spend the last 5 minutes talking about is what I think might be somewhat better options than SB4 right now, considering the very high barriers that I think it places for housing on religious properties. There's a lot of other tools that state housing law. Housing Accountability Act is the law that I use almost every day to help get housing projects approved. Basically creates a fairly streamlined process that, again, cuts through a lot of the layers of discretion that municipalities have. To use the HAA, though, properties would need to be zoned residential. So you want to be checking your zoning, presumably with a land use attorney, to see what's permitted on your property. If commercial uses are permitted, then you may be able to use another bill called AB 2011, which is another recent bill that allows high-density housing as of right on properties that are zoned commercial. There also may be situations where if your city isn't in compliance with state housing law, or if your site is listed in your city's housing element site inventory, that projects may be expedited through what's called the builder's remedy law, which is kind of a very trendy statute now in California. So there's lots of other opportunities, but some of these other opportunities depend on what your site zoning is, what your site topography is, and your state's level of compliance with state housing law. So those are some things that you want to talk about with a housing attorney. Now, none of those options really get you past CEQA necessarily, but religious organizations can take advantage of a law called the Religious Land Use Institutionalized Persons Act, or LUPA, which is a federal statute that provides certain preferential treatment for religious land uses. And there is precedent that religious land uses may have to be exempted from environmental review under CEQA and possibly even from building codes. So there are ways that you can put together existing housing law, like the Housing Accountability Act, with the protections of our LUPA to get protections that I think are even better than SB4. There's also, by the way, for those who are interested in providing transitional or supportive housing, there's AB 2162, which permits an expedited process for transitional housing and does not require union labor, but again, the property would have to be zoned residential. So these are all ways in which religious organizations could use state housing law coupled with federal law in a creative way to try to get housing approved without having to go through what I think is the difficult process of SB4. But to come back to SB4 at the very end here, I think the best way to think about SB4 is as a conversation starter. I think Senator Wiener was thinking this is an all-hands-on-deck situation where we need to get everyone who has an interest in constructing housing at the table to make sure that we can build the housing that we need in this state. And it's not uncommon in housing law over the last decade for laws that start out relatively weak to be strengthened over time. So we've seen this with the laws regarding accessory dwelling units, that they started very weak and then were revised year after year until they got very strong. And I think that may be where we are with SB4, that this was a sort of a starting gambit to get religious organizations starting to think about building housing on their land and then start thinking about the next steps. Part of the reason why the law was watered down so much with the prevailing wage and these other restrictions was because of all the interest groups, of course, who participated in the sausage-making process. So organized labor didn't want to give a CEQA exemption unless they could be sure that they were going to get a piece of the action too. The affordable housing groups wanted to make sure that that there would be sufficient affordability. Environmental groups wanted to make sure that exemptions to this California Environmental Quality Act weren't going to be too broad. And to kind of counteract those pressures, we need a very broad pro-housing constituency also. Right, so we're starting to see cracks forming in organized labor. We've seen organized labor groups get on board with state housing laws. And we've seen environmental groups split and environmental groups getting on board with state housing law. So I think the best way to think about SB4 is as an effort to get religious organizations involved in the kind of campaign to improve our state housing laws so that the next version of SB4 will be more and more effective and more usable.